delighted to be here in Missouri. If not for the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and then the repeal of the Missouri Compromise in 1854, we might not have any reason to be gathered here talking about Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It was the repeal of the Missouri Compromise that led Lincoln to abandon his law career and throw himself back into the political fray. So Missouri plays a central role in the antebellum period and in the statesmanship of Lincoln. My focus this evening is going to be on the Gettysburg Address. Now, the most obvious problem in approaching Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is that we know it so well. And if you received a good education, you might even be able to recite it from memory. Everybody knows the irony of that line, excuse me, where Lincoln says, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here." Ironic, because his brief dedicatory remarks have become the most famous American speech. In fact, the Gettysburg Address makes the top 10 list of speeches in any language. It's right up there with the Apology of Socrates and the Funeral Oration of Pericles, with the added benefit that Lincoln's was actually written and delivered by him, whereas those speeches by Socrates and Pericles come to us secondhand, so to speak, through Plato and Thucydides. So Lincoln's speech arrived at its fame without editorial assistance. Phrases from the Gettysburg Address crop up all over. Article 2 of the French Constitution, for instance, states that, quote, "The principle of the Republic shall be government of the people, by the people, and for the people." American presidents, and none more so than President Obama, pay homage to Lincoln's formulations. They borrow shamelessly from him, sometimes with attribution and sometimes without. In one sense, though, Lincoln was correct about the world not remembering what was said that day. Let me remind you that the main event on November 19th, 1863, was not Lincoln's 2-minute closing remarks, but Edward Everett's 2-hour oration entitled "The Battles of Gettysburg." Very few Americans since have bothered to read it. It's not a bad speech. After all, Everett was reputed to be the finest orator of his day, the successor to old man eloquent himself, Daniel Webster. Nonetheless, Webster's speech is remembered, Everett's speech is remembered only because his intense and lengthy effort was so thoroughly outshone by Lincoln's little squib. To understand the significance of the Gettysburg Address, we need to go beyond the noting and the remembering that Lincoln modestly said would not happen. We want to understand what he accomplished and how he did it, and maybe especially how he did what he did in such brief compass. The Gettysburg Address contains 3 paragraphs, 10 sentences, and 272 words. Astonishingly, since many words are used multiple times, the speech is composed of only 130 distinct words. Today's college students haven't written anything so short with such a limited vocabulary since they were 4th graders, probably. Before turning to the text itself, I wanted to say just a bit about the occasion for the speech. The 3-day Battle of Gettysburg took place at the beginning of July 1863. It was a Union victory, and the Confederates fled the field on July 4th. In retrospect, we know that it was a turning point of the war, but that was not so evident at the time. The casualties were like those of so many Civil War battles, staggering belief. 51,000 American dead and wounded in 3 days. To gain a sense of the scale of the carnage, we might compare it with numbers that we're more familiar with. During our 20-year involvement in Vietnam, 20-year involvement, 58,000 Americans died. Since 9/11, 6,700 American troops have died in the War on Terror, now in its 14th year. Remember that the population of the United States then was 1/10 what it is now. So if you were to translate the death toll from the Civil War into today's population figures, it would not be in the thousands, it would not be in the tens of thousands, it would not be in the hundreds of thousands. It would be 7.5 million men dead. We're familiar today with the tendency of democratic peoples to tire of war, to quail before the terrible blood price. Politically, Lincoln was confronting this problem of war weariness, the way in which grief saps morale and commitment. The problem was not limited to a sense of hopelessness. There was active resistance to the continuance of the war. In the immediate wake of the victory at Gettysburg, riots over the draft broke out in New York City. Over 4 days, in the middle of that July, 120 civilians were killed, including 11 black citizens who were lynched by angry mobs, more than 2,000 people injured. It actually took the arrival of federal troops who were diverted from their pursuit of Lee's Confederate Army and marched instead 200 miles north to restore order to New York City. Some said that the New York draft riots turned the Union victory at Gettysburg into a Confederate victory. So the point I'm trying to make is that the Gettysburg Address is emphatically a war speech. It's a speech designed to rally the North to stay the course. But a most unusual war speech it is, for it never mentions the enemy, or it mentions them only by implication. When Lincoln speaks of those who here gave their lives that that nation might live, his audience would be well aware that there were others who gave their lives that that nation might die, that it would no longer be the United States. The cemetery dedicated at Gettysburg was exclusively a Union cemetery. In fact, in the weeks before the dedication, the townspeople had witnessed the reinterment process as thousands of the battle dead were exhumed from the shallow graves in which they had hastily been placed by those same local citizens back in the sweltering days of July. As they were uncovered, the Union bodies were painstakingly identified and separated from the Confederate bodies. The rebels were simply reburied, coffinless, deeper in the ground where they were found. Most of them were reclaimed later by their home states. The loyal dead were removed, further sorted into their military units, placed in coffins and tidy lines, awaiting honorable burial in the new cemetery. This observation about Lincoln's abstraction from the enemy leads to a general observation about the highly abstract character of the entire speech. No specifics are given. There isn't a proper noun to be found, with the single exception of God. Thus, there's no mention of Gettysburg, just a great battlefield. There's no mention of America, just this continent. There's no mention of the United States, just a new nation, and that nation, and this nation. There's no mention of the parties to the conflict, no North or South, no Union or Confederacy, just a great civil war. Lincoln speaks of our fathers, but no names are given. And although the opening clause, 77 years ago, does refer to a specific date, Lincoln obscures it by giving the lapse of time in biblical language. So to actually figure out the date that's referred to, you have to translate 77 into 87. You then have to subtract 87 from 1863 in order to arrive at the date he's referring to, which is 1776. The tremendous abstraction or generality of the speech, I think, is part of what explains its ability to speak to people in different eras, different time periods and cultures who have no connection to the events at Gettysburg. And yet they feel, as Lincoln might say, that they are blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of those spoken of there. The addressees of the speech are referred to simply as we, the living. Lincoln summons the living to the unfinished work and the great task remaining. So he turns an elegy, a funeral oration, into a call to duty. This abstraction, by the way, of the Gettysburg Address is in marked contrast to an impromptu speech that Lincoln gave on July 7th, just a few days after the victory. Residents of the district had assembled outside the White House to serenade him. This was before the era of the Secret Service and massive barricades around the White House, when interaction between presidents and citizens was much more intimate. So Lincoln appeared on the balcony in response to this serenade and gave some brief remarks. And his remarks prefigure what he will say at Gettysburg. But in many respects, the speech is radically different. It's much more informal, and it's highly specific. He names names. So after thanking the visitors, he says, "How long ago is it? 80-odd years since on the 4th of July, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation by its representatives assembled and declared as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. That was the birthday of the United States of America." After mentioning by name Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, Lincoln goes on to describe the significance of the victory at Gettysburg. "And now, on this last 4th of July just passed, when we have a gigantic rebellion, at the bottom of which is an effort to overthrow the principle that all men are created equal, we have the surrender of a most powerful position and army on that very day, and not only so, but in a succession of battles in Pennsylvania, near to us, through 3 days, so rapidly fought that they might be called one great battle. On the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of the month of July, and on the 4th, the cohorts of those who opposed the declaration that all men are created equal turned tail and ran." Gentlemen, this is a glorious theme and the occasion for a speech, but I am not prepared to make one worthy of the occasion. 4 months later, Lincoln was ready to make that speech. What I'd like to do is sort of try my hand at explication and commentary of a few of the sections of the speech. So let's start with the first paragraph. First paragraph consists of one sentence, but it's quite a sentence. It describes the past, the nation's beginnings. What Lincoln called the birthday of the United States of America in the Serenade speech has been transformed into a sophisticated poetic metaphor that refers to 3 distinct moments. It refers to conception, it refers to birth, and I think it refers to baptism. The past that Lincoln refers to is a past that stretches back before living memory. No one in the audience could have been alive 77 years ago. 77 exceeds the individual's allotment of 70. That's sort of traditional biblical phrase for the natural lifespan of a human being. Lincoln's decision to formulate the date in this biblical language may be a subtle way of highlighting the fact that the founding is now beyond anyone's direct experience. There's an earlier speech of Lincoln's, the Lyceum Address, a quarter century before this. Lincoln was a young man, not yet 30. That speech is also about the founding. And there, Lincoln reflects on the difficulties that the nation would face once those who had personally participated in the revolution were gone. And he noted how the silent artillery of time destroys living history, the kind of history that bears the indubitable testimonies of its own authenticity in the limbs mangled, in the scars of wounds received. I think we're going through this experience today as the veterans of World War II pass from the scene. Right? I heard a factoid that they're dying at the rate of 1,000 a day. Right? We will soon be at the point where that living history, the living history that's visible in the limbs mangled and the scars of wounds received, in which that is gone. So Lincoln argued that once that revolutionary period and the remembrance of that period is past, you need a more enduring substitute for patriotic attachment. Right? Once those scenes of the revolution had faded. So Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, I think, is acting in accord with that insight from the Lyceum Address. And so he does not try to conjure up the drama of the revolution. Instead, he substitutes more peaceful, natural imagery. So what does he say happened in 1776? Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. As the date indicates, it's a document, the Declaration of Independence, that brings the nation into being. A document, unlike historical memory, is permanent. It's there to be read and understood by every successive generation. Note also that the document that Lincoln looks to is not the Constitution, but the Declaration. The point I think he's making is that ours is a uniquely ideational founding. Right? It's based on declaratory words. In keeping with that, Lincoln's next two clauses mention two key concepts: liberty and equality. He links each of these concepts to that dominant metaphor of birth. He projects back before the moment of birth to the moment of conception, saying that the nation was conceived in liberty. What could that mean? And how seriously are we to take this language of sexual congress? One possibility is that Lincoln means to suggest that just as a child is conceived in love, the nation was conceived in liberty, or love of liberty, maybe. Somehow liberty or love of liberty was the seminal passion that eventually produced the nation. A variant of that interpretation might say that conceived in liberty could mean that the Declaration of Independence was itself a free act, right? A chosen act, not a forced or necessitous act. Again, as children are conceived in an act of love, the nation was conceived in an act of liberty. One final possibility is that Lincoln means to refer further back, even centuries back, into the colonial period. Alexis de Tocqueville, the great analyst of American democracy, argues that the spirit of liberty was present from the first in the English colonies. Tocqueville explains how the aristocratic liberty of the mother country quickly assumed a new and more democratic form in the New World. So I think it's hard to say with certainty what Lincoln means by this phrase, and it is just a very evocative phrase, conceived in liberty. And the various speculations that I've thrown out, I think, are not actually in conflict with one another. And we could, in fact, put them all together in one sentence and say that a love of liberty, long present among the colonists, did flare up in one decisive, freely chosen act, which had the effect of transforming British subjects into the Founding Fathers. I have one further hunch about the gentle character of Lincoln's account of the nation's origins. I suspect that he didn't want to come anywhere near words like revolution or independence while in the midst of putting down a gigantic rebellion. For Lincoln, there was always a crystal clear distinction between a justified revolution, like the American Revolution, undertaken in response to well-documented violations of rights, and an unjustified rebellion in which one portion of a democratic people, unhappy with the results of a perfectly constitutional election, attempts to nullify that election by secession. So the secessionists were in no way comparable to the American revolutionaries. However, Lincoln didn't have time in this speech to explain the theoretical difference, although he did do that at considerable length in his first inaugural address. So instead, what he does here is to find euphemisms for the American Revolution, like brought forth and conceived in liberty. He uses the language of generative Congress to describe an act of political separation. Given that he was resisting those who wanted a further separation, it wasn't really the time to praise the dissolution of political bands. After liberty, the other feature of the founding that's highlighted is equality. Lincoln says that the nation is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, whereas liberty is linked backwards to the nation's conception. Equality points forward. It's prospective. It involves dedication. So here I think is where he's really kind of playing on the notion of baptism or christening. Right? As in the moment of baptism or christening, the infant nation is being placed on a certain path, right? Dedicated. Although Lincoln quotes verbatim from the Declaration, he also puts his own gloss on those words, and famously he introduces some key changes. I think, as we all know, the Declaration speaks of equality as a self-evident truth. Right? A truth held to be self-evident by the American people. Now, The Americans knew that that self-evident truth was unfortunately not evident to everyone the world over. It's still not evident to everyone the world over today. But Americans did expect that in time the scales would fall from the eyes of others. They were being temporarily blinded by false doctrines like the divine right of kings. Self-evident is an interesting term. It's a term borrowed from geometry. A self-evident truth is an axiom. An axiom doesn't require proof, and in fact, an axiom cannot be proved. You just see it, or you don't. I think I can illustrate pretty quickly. If A equals B, and B equals C, then A equals C. You see it, right? According to the Declaration, human equality is like that. Right? It's axiomatic. All men, black and white, male and female, simply are equal in the relevant sense of being endowed by their Creator with certain natural rights to life and liberty. That's the essential truth of the human condition. That truth is not invalidated by the harsh fact that most human beings in most times and places have lived under political orders that violate their natural rights. And slavery is just the most dramatic instance of that. According to the Declaration, despotic regimes, unjust institutions are illegitimate. It follows that people may exercise their right of revolution in order to establish new governments founded upon the consent of the governed and respectful of individuals' pre-existing natural rights. Although there are plenty of places in Lincoln's writings where he uses this sort of orthodox language of axiom and self-evident to describe the primary capital T truths of the Declaration, his most famous formulation, which is here in the Gettysburg Address, here he calls human equality not an axiom or a self-evident truth, but a proposition. Proposition is another term borrowed from geometry. A proposition, though, unlike an axiom, requires a proof. That's why you have to be dedicated to it. It's a theorem that has to be demonstrated in practice. So, the question arises, what might explain Lincoln's shift from one Euclidean term to the other? And by the way, Lincoln knew his Euclid. He had put himself through the first 6 books of Euclid in order to develop his logical reasoning. In shifting from self-evident to proposition, I don't think we're to take that to mean that Lincoln now somehow doubts the truth of human equality. Not at all. It's rather, I think, that he wants to highlight the needfulness of translating an abstract truth into concrete political form. As early, in fact, as the Lyceum Address, Lincoln described the founders as experimental scientists or mathematicians drawn to an unproven proposition. What he says there is that they wanted to prove the capability of a people to govern themselves. The current crisis, however, the crisis during the Civil War and in the decade leading up to the Civil War, was more severe than the crisis at the time of the Revolution. At the time of the founding, I believe, and I think it can be proven, at the time of the founding there was agreement, widespread agreement that all human beings were created equal, even if there was no political ability on the part of a very weak federal government to do anything about the domestic institution of slavery in the states. Nonetheless, all then understood that slavery was an evil. Even those who argued that slavery was necessary, and there were many of those, but they had the decency to call it a necessary evil. But subsequent generations had fallen away from that view. Led by John C. Calhoun, Southerners had openly repudiated the truths of the Declaration and had taken to calling equality not a self-evident truth, but a self-evident lie. And instead of calling slavery a necessary evil, they had started calling it a positive good. In the 1850s, as the crisis of the House divided escalated, Lincoln argued that that crisis had arisen because a considerable portion of the American people had lost sight of the truth upon which their own rights depended. Lincoln puts this very concisely in his 1854 Peoria address. Here's what he says. When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs himself and also governs another man, that is more than self-government. That is despotism. Since the Civil War was brought on by a serious departure from the meaning of equality, and as a result also from the meaning of consent or self-government, it seems right for Lincoln, when speaking in the midst of that war, to imply that a truth once firmly held as self-evident had now moved into the ranks of a propositional truth that must be proved in action. That action being the restoration of a union dedicated to the principle of equality. All right, so we're about ready to wrap up the first paragraph. I will pick up the pace. So in the opening paragraph, in 30 words, Lincoln has performed an act of remembrance. His description of our fathers is meant to make the audience reverential, make them feel piety. But at the same time, the generative imagery conveys the message that each successive cohort of Americans is essential to the maturation and completion of the founding. So the necessary proof is ongoing. It's up to us to live out the timeless truth to which the nation has been pledged. With this single sentence, Lincoln forms the nation's self-understanding. It's a self-understanding that unites filial piety with progress. Action here and now is mandated by fidelity to the past. Lincoln's political stance manages to combine liberal elements with profoundly conservative elements. The gloss he puts on the Declaration of Independence leads directly to the next paragraph and its opening word, now. This paragraph, which is more than twice the length of the first, explains the meaning of the Great Civil War. The war is a test. And what is being tested? Whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Note that Lincoln does not say our nation. He says that nation. It's really kind of a strange locution. Right? Whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. I think he does this because when he says that nation, he means that nation as described above in the opening paragraph. He doesn't want the audience to stray outside the bounds of the idea that he has so carefully crafted there. Right? What is at stake is the survival of that new nation that sought to combine liberty and equality. And more than that, at stake is the very possibility of political life based on such premises. So Lincoln enlarges the stakes beyond mere national survival. Right? The failure of the American experiment would constitute the failure of popular government altogether. It's striking how similar the language of the Gettysburg Address is to the language of Lincoln's 1861 message to Congress in special session. I just want to read you a couple of passages from this speech. Lincoln there asserts that, quote, "This issue embraces more than the fate of these United States. It presents to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic, a democracy, a government of the people by the same people, can or cannot maintain its territorial integrity against its own domestic foes. It presents the question whether discontented individuals can break up their government and thus practically put an end to free government upon the earth." Again, later in the address, he says, "Our popular government has often been called an experiment. 2 points in it our people have already settled: the successful establishing and the successful administering of it. One still remains: its successful maintenance against a formidable internal attempt to overthrow it. It is now for them to demonstrate to the world that those who can fairly carry an election can also suppress a rebellion, that ballots are the rightful and peaceful successors of bullets, and that when ballots have fairly and constitutionally decided, there can be no successful appeal back to bullets, that there can be no successful appeal except to ballots themselves at succeeding elections. Such will be a great lesson of peace, teaching men that what they cannot take by an election, neither can they take by a war, teaching all the folly of being the beginners of a war. These lengthier passages, which were addressed to Congress in the first months of the war, I think help to explicate the more condensed and poetic rendering that we get at Gettysburg, where Lincoln is speaking to a grieving public and trying to convey to them the purposes of the war. This great lesson of peace, it turns out, must be midwifed by the war power of the government. With a sublimity that may never be surpassed, Lincoln pleads for public support to stay the course. As Lincoln understood, there was a perverse logic. There's a logic that led from the theoretical denial of equality, which was expressed in the South's heretical view that slavery was just, and that slavery was a positive good. There's a link between that denial of equality and the denial of majority rule, which we see expressed in the South's attempted secession. In other words, the truths of the Declaration are intertwined. Once you deny one, once you deny that foundational truth of equality, the other truths will crumble as well. The dynamic of despotism was such that the rejection of the first principle leads inexorably to further assaults. And you can see this in what happens in the decades before the war, where there is a kind of assault on constitutional rights. Defenders of slavery tried to undermine the rights of speech and press and assembly and petition, at least whenever those rights were attempted to be exercised by the opponents of slavery. Frederick Douglass, the great African-American abolitionist, gave, I think, a pretty graphic image of the South's policy. He says, I understand the first purpose of the slave power to be the suppression of all anti-slavery discussion. One end of the slave's chain must be fastened to a padlock in the lips of Northern freemen, else the slave will himself become free. Lincoln echoes this thought in his Cooper Union address, where he raises the question, this is a speech from 1860, he raises the question, what is it that would satisfy the South? Right? Could we conciliate them? What is it they really want from the North? And Lincoln's conclusion in that speech is this and this only: cease to call slavery wrong and join them in calling it right. In other words, the real demand of the South was to silence the moral sense of the nation. I'm reminded of Martin Luther King's famous line, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Lincoln was very much aware of that linkage. We might call it the reciprocity of rights, the inescapable reciprocity of rights. And as a result, Lincoln always argued that it was imperative to restore the belief in universal human equality, not only for the sake of enslaved blacks, but for the sake of white citizens. Right? Once you lose the notion of equality, everyone is endangered. All right, so more quickly then, in the second paragraph of the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln homes in on this present moment, now. The purpose for which they have gathered now and here is the dedication of the cemetery to those who upheld the nation's dedication to equality. Lincoln concludes, it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. Now, imagine yourself as Edward Everett. Okay? Remember, his speech went first. It was a very lengthy oration. Given that Edward Everett had just finished his lengthy oration, Lincoln might have been expected to say something in praise of Everett. Something along the lines of, "It's altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, and our wonderful speaker has just performed this task beautifully." Instead, Lincoln says something very different. He says, "It's altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but." Right? I imagine that your middle school English teachers told you not to start sentences with "but." All right? And how much worse to start a paragraph with "but," as Lincoln does here. Your teachers had their reasons for that, right? But is a coordinating conjunction. It's supposed to be used to join parts of a sentence. Well, Lincoln never had more than 12 months of formal schooling, and he apparently had not gotten this message. I am convinced that this "but" is the most significant use of the word in all of English literature. Resort to "but" always indicates that the speaker is seriously qualifying what he has just said. Okay? So if you hear, "I love you, but," right, you know something not good is coming. Right? So what is Lincoln retracting in this third paragraph? A paragraph that is half again as long as the first two put together. Well, he tells the audience that they cannot do what they came to do. The language of lamentation is inadequate to the task of commemoration. Lincoln pivots from words to deeds, and at the same time he pivots from the ground wherein the dead lie buried to that cause for which they died. What the Union soldiers advanced through their struggle and blood sacrifice, the living must see through to victory. Lincoln, like Pericles before him in the funeral oration, must redirect the energies of his audience to something more productive than eulogizing. And Lincoln's final two sentences do that. Lincoln's final two sentences, and especially that very long last one, which is 3 times longer than the next longest sentence, explain what it is that the living ought to do instead of tarrying amidst the graves. They should be dedicated to the great task remaining. That dedication has 4 components expressed in 4 clauses. And fascinatingly, these 4 clauses, each of which begins with a "that," seem to parallel the 4 famous clauses of the Declaration of Independence. And if you flip the sheet that was handed out, you can see the sort of parallelism of these clauses. So if Jefferson's sentence in the Declaration could be said to have invented the nation, Lincoln's parallel sentence will reinvent it. Now, to be effective, this dedication and devotion that Lincoln calls for must take the active form of resolve. Right? Resolution is a virtue that Lincoln had been interested in, I suspect, ever since he'd read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography as a youngster. Resolve or resolution is one of Franklin's 13 virtues, and here's how Franklin defines it. Resolve to perform what you ought, perform without fail what you resolve. So in the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln calls upon the living to resolve 3 things: that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. Since the time is about up, I want to say something about just one of these clauses, the new birth of freedom, which is to transpire under God. I think it's very natural and predictable for us today to hear in this phrase, the new birth of freedom, to hear a foreshadowing of the perfected Constitution containing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And it's certainly true that by November 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation had been in effect for almost a year, which meant that if the Union prevailed, slavery at least would be abolished. And so we were already pointed towards that 13th Amendment. But the fate of black citizenship and black suffrage, the subjects of the 14th and 15th Amendments, that I think was more ambiguous at this point. So we shouldn't forget that this is a war speech. It's designed to ensure that the nation and the cause of popular government shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln uses the future tense in his very last sentence, shall, right? But it's formulated in the negative, right? Shall not perish from the earth. His words don't soar into the empyrean. Not perishing is the aim. So at this point, Lincoln is concerned as much with the survival as the perfection of democracy. But survival is not a small task. It's not a small aim. It might even be earth-shaking, since the union preserved will constitute the needed proof that a nation conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition of equality, can indeed endure. The union has moral content, right? And its salvation alone constitutes a new birth of freedom. Thus, while I think the phrase does allude to the end of slavery, in a larger sense, Lincoln's topic is the fate of self-government. As we've seen, the overall movement of the speech is linear. It moves from past to present to future, one paragraph each. At the same time, the movement is cyclical. He moves from the birth imagery in the opening paragraph to the dominance of death and references to death in the middle, and then finally to the new birth of freedom in the last sentence. So we might ask the question, how does this new birth, right, which is said to be the birth of freedom, how does that differ from the original birth, which was the birth of the nation? Right? In other words, is the liberty spoken of in the opening sentence, is that the same or different, same as or different from the freedom spoken of at the end? Right? Why does he switch from liberty to freedom? The liberty of the opening was associated with the conception of the nation, not its birth, whereas freedom itself is now the thing being born, the new birth of freedom. So why this intriguing shift from conceived in liberty to the new birth of freedom? Quick review, when I speculated earlier about the meaning of conceived in liberty, I gave three possibilities: conceived in the love of liberty, conceived in an act of liberty, or conceived in the setting or sort of matrix of English liberty. None of those possibilities implied that all men would secure their natural right to liberty in this particular new nation. In other words, conceived in liberty did not guarantee equality of liberty. Of the authors of the Declaration, Lincoln said, quote, "They did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon, such a good. They meant simply to declare the right, so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit." During the Civil War, circumstances had changed dramatically, such that the original conception in liberty could progress towards the actual birth of freedom as a consequence of the renewed commitment to equality. So I believe that Lincoln uses the word freedom to connote this combination, this equality in liberty, the conception and the dedication now finally realized. I think it's important for us today to remember that the new birth of freedom that Lincoln speaks of was an infant freedom. It was in need of further maturation, and in part that means that, you know, it will grow and spread as it did in the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments. But maturation also means the acquisition of moral and intellectual virtue through the disciplines of study so the sort of habit of study. So I suspect that as a nation, we've done better in extending freedom than we have in educating freedom. In any case, as Lincoln foresaw, there will always be plenty for future generations to do. In closing, let me just say one word about under God. We shouldn't overlook the presence of that phrase, under God. According to Lincoln, the superintendence of God plays a role in the new birth of freedom. The divinity, of course, was present in the opening proposition, right? All men are created equal. There's a reference there to the Creator. According to the Declaration of Independence, our equality is connected with our creatureliness, the fact that we are created beings. But the God of the Declaration is also nature's God, at least in the opening paragraph. It's nature's God, not necessarily the biblical God. One can believe in species-based human equality without believing in divine providence or God's ongoing benevolent care for his creation. I think that Lincoln's civic religion brings God closer. And this final formulation where the nation itself is said to be under God suggests, to me at least, a more politically active, justice-seeking, providential order. It's a theological suggestion that comes to full fruition in Lincoln's second inaugural. And it's hard to imagine, but the second inaugural is an even greater speech than the Gettysburg Address. But we'll leave that for another occasion. Thank you.